from the tutor side, based on the performance that you guys have had over the last 2 terms for your phase 1. And in some sense, there's really one of 3 scenarios. It's a pass, complete to pass, or a fail. I think in your case, our conversations and based on the review and everything, you have no conditions and you've passed phase 1. All teams basically have to submit 2 copies, hardback books, basically as a thesis. That's going to be week 1 of term 1, basically in September. Alex will send you a note about those things. So you'll have the 2 print copies that will be submitted to Clem, and digital uploads, basically for assessment of all the material that you guys generated. That'll be on OneDrive that Alex will send across to you as well. Part of that document, anyway, is a 15-page thesis prep document, which is a kind of critical self-assessment on your part of basically your thesis, the principal research questions that you guys are looking at it, and how in method and practice you guys are working on those problems. So I think in many ways, the way that we've run the studio, a lot of the kind of development of the brief, because each of the projects is different, I think a lot of that work has been done in terms of kind of acknowledging your response to the elemental and so forth. But when it comes to kind of applied scenarios, and when we talk about phenomenon as technology, I think that this is a space where we, I think, have to become a bit more expressive about what we mean in practice. Because in some sense, we've been working not in a linear way, but we've been working to try to tease out what that actually really means. And in your case, thinking about water as a medium, obviously it supports life, but the practicalities of that are on one extreme, trying to control like a concept like the cloud. On the other hand, it's about the delivery of that in a meaningful way. And that second part of the project hasn't really been spoken to, but I think that there are, from a research perspective, examples that you guys have brought to the table, which I think are worth revisiting in terms of how that now, as a mobile kind of water infrastructure, opens itself up to maybe different concepts of ritual, different concepts of deployment. How people basically have access to this, I think, is very important, and how much of that is individual and how much of that is collective. And that goes in some respect in a decision about how urban is your project and how remote it is. The last videos that we talked about and the last video that you guys showed, this was really about almost like a nomadic infrastructure. And in many ways, I think that becomes a very plausible scenario and probably the scenario that you'll follow. But I think as you have the moment to think about how prototypical is your system, I think it's important to kind of think about different scenarios where water in some way can be utilized as something that is a positive thing. Like, it's hard to not look at the news recently of how much flooding has happened with extreme rain, right? So that the aspect of duration and how that's received and how that's managed and stored and all of those things, I think, has to be part of the next stage of development of the brief. At the same time, I feel like you guys have done some good work in terms of like visualizing some of the things. But I feel like as we're moving forward, I don't know if film is the right analogy, but I think we will have to become much more cinematic in terms of trying to communicate how these non-agents that in some sense are carriers of support systems for life interface with kind of human organizations. And I say that because, culturally speaking, that interfacing may be something very different, and you guys brought some attention to that with, from step wells to other kinds of strategies. But there's something to me about some of the larger kind of settlement organizations, which I think somehow has a key to your project in some way. not in terms of generating like master plans of settlements or any of that stuff, but understanding that there is a correlation around resources, that if it is sustained, even if it's migratory, that it does have an influence in terms of how human settlements revolve around that. I think that this would be important. So there is some aspects of your project that you guys have to kind of take a position on. If it is about the water retention, water harvesting, and basically making that accessible, that can be a version of actually what you saw in some of the textile prototypes that are out in the world. You know, it can be something as localized as that, or it can be more kind of intelligent in terms of a network of even those relationships between those things, so that they become signaling beacons and they become ways of addressing certain aspects of uncertainty that in some sense are continuous issues around issues of life dependent resources. So application is something that I think I'd like you guys to think a little bit more explicitly, but I would like you to do that not by like a wish list of what you want to do, but how you develop the prototype and what it can do. So right now we have a sketch for how this thing is working. I think it would be interesting as well, since the first 5 weeks of the phase 2 in term 1 is very much dedicated to prototyping, that some of that work is done from the summer, and that you start to really work on using the prototyping lab and using experiments to try to get a sense of how harvesting could actually operate, how these things could potentially become carriers, how do they interface when they touch the ground, how do they move collectively, like to start to think about it not in a technologically kind of mechanical or automated world, but to really try to harness, I think, some of the things that we're speaking about towards the elemental. So I really want us to think about phenomenon as technology. But that by itself, I think, is more of a provocation in terms of trying to understand how much of this is a passive system that's designed intelligently to do a lot of the hard work, and how much of this is dealing with kind of brute force, responding to scales of weather and environment. So I think we have to be more aware of these things, basically. So I do think that there is almost like a kind of airport traffic control strategy that we have to somehow consider as a way for bringing these things down to earth, and for these things themselves to organize themselves beyond just like, let's say, bottles of water that land, or these kind of vessels. It could be something much more than that collectively. And I think that there isn't, to mind a solution to this. I think it's more, it's not about right or wrong, it's just about a decision to take on it and to see how we work on that productively. But overall, anyway, I was happy with where you guys got to. I think the presentation was provocative. And now I think comes a different stage of experimentation, which is the complexities of phenomenon and materiality. And at the same time, like I said, I think the game platform, filmic kind of time-based aspect, I think needs to be pushed a lot more. I like the closing film. I think it was useful. But I think you need to really push it a lot farther. David made a comment here relative to extreme water with one of his favorite paintings. He's saying, from Simon DeMille, I'll send this to you guys, kind of Noah's Ark, which I think is also a different kind of concept, which you can consider. I think the issue of how you interface with water in all forms of extreme, from scarcity to overuse, flooding, I think we need to be pretty committed to a scenario. So my feeling, the harvesting aspect is the one that is probably the most pertinent. harvesting and retention. But that influences a lot when we talk about the difference between water that's drinkable versus just water. So those different contexts, even from the discussions we had about desalination and other things, there's so many different ways of interpreting this. I just think we need to be very clear of our scenario. But overall, I also thought you had very good comments from the jury. I mean, in terms of an initial response, it wasn't always like you guys are swimming in the clouds kind of thing. So I think it's good. And I think the simulation work makes it convincing. And I would really like to see the next level of all of that. Do you guys have any thoughts yourselves relative to the comments from the jury?
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I know that the reference to Noah is probably quite irrelevant. It's a really beautiful painting, I think, and I would like to know what some of the students might think of it. And it's another aspect of extreme water, you know, and it's also strangely prescient about the environmental crisis, isn't it? About animals fleeing fires, etc., animals fleeing water. It's I know there's a lot of paintings about it, but that's, for me, is a really beautiful one.
I think it's great that you shared that, David. And honestly, because I was next actually to a forest fire, watching basically airplanes diving into a bay to basically pick up water to basically drop it onto this forest fire. So there are a lot of...
what was that in Greece? Where's that in Greece?
No, at the moment I'm in Italy. There was, yeah, basically a large fire in the south of Italy. And just seeing these kind of systems operate, there is a beautiful choreography of these things, which I think is something that's very important for this team also to recognize that the human signaling of things is very important, because it's almost like in, let's call it more old school ways, when we were much more connected to the land, we understood weather, and farmers and so forth understood it better than most, right? To see the patterns, to know when it was going to rain, to really have a deeper kind of sensibility to the environment. Now here with your architecture, as synthetic of an organism as it is in some sense symbiotic, right? Or it should evolve kind of more symbiotic relationships with us. And part of that is somehow designing maybe more intuitive ways of thinking about how that communication is happening, right? So when these petals are falling, it's like, you know, being in fall in a forest, when the wind is falling, you start to see these leaves or these, you know, seedlings falling. It becomes something that is also quite beautiful. So, and then Patrick did mention that the studio struggles between saving the world and being poetry, which is not a bad thing. So I think in your case, all of those aspects should be somehow designed and taken into consideration. In the crudest sense, it would be a water balloon that just drops, which would not be very beautiful. The most beautiful sense, it would be something that, in the same way that it's trying to resist, you know, gravity in terms of falling in a way that is safeguarding its life force in some sense, it's also creating a vessel that then humans can basically access the water, right? So I think that this can be something really beautiful. But even in the most kind of brute force mechanical ways, like just seeing some airplanes dumping water with these kind of textile buckets that they scoop the water from, it is an amazingly complex choreography, even if it's just 2 or 3 airplanes, or helicopters in this case. So I think that there are things for us to kind of look at these references and start to also construct what it is that we're actually doing. The other thing is this edible water that I was talking to you guys about, which is like no packaging. You know, if we can start to consider those kind of technologies, then to the degree of how much this is literally architecture as a building, I mean, for me, it's not that important. It's never been. For you, I don't think it's that important. Otherwise, you wouldn't have signed up for this particular studio. But I think how you can start to think about space in a much more shared and collective way, I think, speaks to maybe some of that stuff that Claude Perrant was working on with Yves Klein. This reference that I think I shared with you guys very early on, which was much more elemental architecture, where he felt that there was no need for enclosure. Through fire, through water and wind, we could generate all of the things that are necessary for human inhabitation. So I think your thesis prep and your document should be really rich with reference, because I don't think that there's one that directly correlates with what you're doing. But I think all of them have an influence in terms of situating the work. And I think that that's important. And I also think, like, in the history of my studio anyway, we've had a series of self-organizing kind of mobile kind of flight systems. Some of them have, like the previous one that you saw, which was just about dropping. Other ones are maybe more mechanically controlled, like swarms. In your case, I think we need to push the ecological aspect of phenomenon. So it's not like we're chasing water. It's just that once these vessels are filled, then a different behavior is emerging. And I think that those different behaviors should be qualified in some of the simulations. So I found the simulations interesting that you guys did. But in some sense now, I think like the next level of that has to happen, where it's not a pure datascape, or it's not a pure datascape like a Unityscape without, let's say, influence of volume and water, because that's our medium, and to translate that relative to where people are, because that's the other thing. It's almost like a dating app. We're trying to bring two people together. One is a non-human and one is a human, because the issue is resource. And this is where I think the concept of infrastructure becomes really interesting when it's mobile. So I think that has a lot of meaningful aspects to think about that. And that also ties in, to be honest with you, with all of the stuff that we were doing last year with migratory communities and people that are displaced and all of that stuff, because I think people don't recognize how nomadic society has become, but for the wrong reasons. And that's only going to, unfortunately, become probably more prevalent.
Sorry, just one point. I think Tyler is in the waiting room still.
I invited Tyler in.
Something.
Sorry, I'm a one-man show at the moment.
I think.
Hi, Tyler.
Hi, so.
Sorry, I thought I tried to invite you. I must have lost you.
Okay.
But we're recording this anyway.
Okay.
The good news is you passed.
Okay, thanks.
So that's the big picture, and that I'm happy with what you guys are doing, and you have a lot of work to do moving forward. That's the general overview.
Okay. Okay, thanks. I will watch the recording.
Yeah. Just teasing you. I don't want you to think that I didn't keep you in the meeting for some reason. Okay. I was just asking if there were any questions. I'm happy with where you're going. I think you guys have worked a lot on the thesis, and I think it's very important to think about the scenarios of how people get access now to the resource. So I think we have to shift the intention in terms of like, how does this now interface with populations? How does it communicate its interfacing, and how does it make it accessible to people? So I think that that's the next stage of development, and that should be part of your thesis prep document. I also am asking you guys to work on the prototyping aspect of your project, since the prototyping lab is going to be open. And I think honestly we should try to develop that in a way that's not mechanical, that's really trying to take one second, because I have to move. Give me 1 second, okay? Sorry guys, I had to change rooms. Anyhow, I think overall, I think you guys are in a very good position. I think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of simulation to make it more experiential and to communicate, so that this becomes really like building, you know, a more symbiotic relationship between your system and humans. And I think the scenarios and so forth, I think the more prototypical your system is, the better it is for me. I don't think that we have to overly agonize over a site or any of this kind of stuff that other studios do. I think the main importance is to understand how we extract moisture, make that into something that is really a resource, and give that over to people. I was just mentioning that last year's studio that was dealing with displaced communities and so forth, there are so many scenarios that this can be attached to, that I think that a lot of that information also is legible and you can use it in terms of scenarios of that. So if that's post-disaster or if that's migratory kind of political refugees, there's so many issues. The most important thing, I think, is for us to develop a system that can deal with the issue of scalability and to also deal with technologies that we use, really trying to be much more elemental and much less about introducing a heavy kind of almost like electronic technology to it. I think it should be very primitive in some way. That doesn't mean that it's not intelligent. It's just trying to design that intelligence as embedded features in the piece itself. Okay. Do you guys have any other questions?
I have a question regarding the climate scientists that we were discussing, that it would be good to communicate with someone.
Yes.
I saw there are some Imperial College, I think, has a department about climate and environment, and also King's College, but I was wondering whether you have any suggestions about like a specific scientist that could be more, could be also closer to us and to our work, so he would be more able to understand what we are doing.
Yeah, I mean, King's College has a relationship to Somerset House, where my studio is. So I can see, because there's a list of scientists, because they tried to do this kind of hybrid arts scientist thing. So they've given me a detail of some scientists potentially that would be open for collaboration in some sense. So I can have a look at that. But I think generally speaking, I'm not so sure that you need that detailed information. I think it's useful to have a discussion about things for you guys to consider. I'm not necessarily sure you need a collaborator in that sense, because I think you're not really trying to translate that data explicitly. So for example, like weather systems, from a technological perspective, I think it would be much more interesting to understand how those systems are actually working. You know, how do they get their information from satellite data? How do they translate that? How does that set up certain ideas of probability? And you don't even really need to understand all of those things. You just need to understand how your system will interface with those kind of systems. Do you understand what I mean? Like the contact point is just in terms of interpreting data. But your system can just be really a very passive system that's in the air, right? Because the locative aspect is something that's important. We're not trying to move water migratorily, you know, thousands of miles. I mean, or at least I'm not under that impression at this stage. So
I wonder if I can come in and be annoying. You mustn't forget the poetic aspects of what you're doing. I mean, there's a little bit in that film Gravity. I know it's a very commercial film, but where she's crying, but her tear floats off into because there's no gravity, floats off her face. And I just thought that was really beautiful sort of moment, and but in a way to do with what you're interested in. And so I don't think you should forget that. And maybe you might look at the opposite of where there is no water. There's the novel Dune, which tries to explore an environment where there is no water. And sometimes it helps when you're doing a project, you look at what the complete opposite of what you're trying to do, and then it sort of focuses, it brings into a kind of clear picture what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think
I don't know. See what I'm trying to say it.
Yes, David, it's very clear, and I think it's very important what you say.
You have to be you have to be a poet as well. That's why being an architect is so unbelievably demanding, isn't it? You have to be engineer, poet, builder, mechanical, and you know, all of these things simultaneously. And sometimes I think that poetic aspect gets buried. Anyway, sorry about that.
No, I think that also the reference of Dune is interesting. I mean that's how H.R. Geiger got involved in film and in architecture in some sense, and all of those things, through those stage sets and all of that stuff. I mean, the reality of all of this, I think it's very important to maintain that poetic aspect, because in some sense we're trying to challenge the kind of engineering way of addressing infrastructure, which in some sense is like, you know, in one way you could read this project as a water management system, but it wouldn't, you know, that's mobile. And on one level, I think that that's what the project is. On the other hand, it's about a distributed system. And I think the more that it's localized and it can be like a passive agent that's just basically floating in air, you know, it can be collecting things on time cycles that doesn't have to have a one-to-one correlation with need. So it's not like a tap that turns on and off, but it's actually like almost like cycles of life. Like, you know, that there's like, you know, I don't know, if you're next to an orchard, you know when the oranges are coming, you know the difference between that and the lemons and all this other stuff. There is this kind of connection,
yes,
to that, which maybe is a bit more primal, which I think could be really positive in this case. So I think for the team anyway, I agree completely, David, that they have to maintain the poetics. I do think from a technical perspective, it's important that they understand how these kind of technological weather systems work, because I think that there may be a clue to that in terms of how their systems feed into this kind of idea that, you know, it doesn't have to be a helicopter or a drone that has to work actively all the time, that they can be passive, almost like seedlings that are floating in the wind, but to understand how they can sort of jump onto those kind of like jet stream highways in some sense to move water in some way, to move their vessels into different locations. I think that could be a powerful way of thinking about it. But yeah, I think it's an interesting moment for the project because I think in many ways it triggers a lot of ideas potentially. Then the question is, as soon as I take one decision on materiality, it opens up a lot of friction. So I think you have to be cycling through certain kind of behaviors and think about the material as a metamaterial that is trying to give you some knowledge about harvesting versus that's my product specification of that material. And the more you do that, I think the better it's going to be. Okay. But I think it's exciting, and just to mention, we will do a Unity workshop. I got confirmation that we'll do it at the end of August. So we'll do it end of August, first week of September. We'll do 10 days. So I'll communicate that stuff more directly so you guys can make your travel plans. And I'll try to arrange some other things over the break too, but in some sense, it's not necessary that you all have to be in one location. But I would encourage you to use a prototyping lab, as I said before, and for the time that you're in. And we can be more strategic about the time that people are away and when they're back.
Now, so Theo, maybe a more advanced class about Unreal, because in the end, you saw the mini video. We wanted to, in the beginning, we wanted to import all our simulations or the cloud simulations and that, but it wasn't easy to do that. It was very challenging and we had several technical issues. So that's why we ended with like more generic images that didn't communicate exactly the project. They seemed like more, the agency more floating around.
I mean, I think in this case, to be honest with you, I think it's very important that you guys really try to experiment with this. I mean, I'll try to get people involved, but I have to be honest with you, like our studio doesn't really fit very kindly to the way that people use a lot of these tools, and for sure not architects, 100%. So I think it's important that you guys do some research, and if you find somebody that you think is, you know, somebody that I should consider, you know, make that available to me. But even in the context of some of the stuff that I've asked from people, like even to do a Unity workshop, I have to be honest with you, it's not straightforward. In the end, it's a bit of a hybrid between doing stuff which is maybe more augmented reality, because I thought that could be an interesting way to explore some of the stuff, and coupling that with issues of image translation, topography, and agents. So, you know, it's a sketch.
Can I, Daphne?
Yes.
Do you know who Philip K. Dick is? Have you heard of? Have you read any of his books?
Yeah, the electric.
You know, he wrote a book about a man who sculpted clouds, didn't he? I can't remember.
I've only read a few of his books. I haven't read this one.
Which was
all I would urge. I mean, Theo made us. I think there are a lot of engineers in the world, but there aren't many poets, and I would urge all of you to see your work in that context, which is sort of questioning, rather than provide this as a solution to a problem we don't know what it is. I know I'm rambling, but it seems to me this is the big gift that the DRL can give. It really is questions, you know, and seeing technical problems as part of a poetic view of life. I don't know what you think, Daphne. Anyway.
Yeah, it's very good to hear that, to encourage that someone encourages towards this aspect of our work, because it's true that we are struggling. We are in between, always creating something that can be poetic. And I think that we tried to give this impression, at least in the presentation. But also we
No,
have
I
this
think you
aspect
did.
of the technological aspect, and that it is really
I think the thing that you guys
at pressure. Yeah.
is just, I mean, you know, everyday life can be amazingly poetic. It's how you approach it, right? You don't see the divide between the technical and the poetic. Actually, I see it much more entangled, and I think that's where the deep questions come from. It's like technology is a very human thing. It's not something outside of us, so it's easy to kind of confuse it with aspects of gadgetry and mechanical things. But actually, technology at the heart of it is you know, is basically the way that we are addressing each other, the way that we think about the world, the way that we relate. In this case, I think why I'm returning to technology in a almost old school way is that the concept of techne anyway is about bringing forth. You know, it's about poesis. It is about asking questions.
Yes.
At the heart of it, I think, you know, I agree with David completely. The only thing that I would say is that the interpretation of poetry in this case, the more real that you are, I actually do think the more primal and the more communicative it will be. So I think that there is something very deeply inherent about survival that brings out a certain relationship to the world that really cuts across all of the kind of bullshit and the things that people talk about from storytelling, because I think this is also something which architecture has fallen into narrative. And this is where I feel like our studio sits uncomfortably between those things, right? That's why it's like, is it science fiction? No, it's not science fiction. But is it literally off-the-shelf technology? No, it's not that either. So it has to be walking the tightrope, basically. And the more honest you are and more experimental, the sharper that tightrope becomes in terms of like clarity of actually what's right and what's wrong and how you take decisions about what's the next step. So I don't see it as ambiguous. And I don't see it as just people that are against architecture just talking about stories and these things. So poetry is really tied to life. It's different from just basic literature.
I think you should type that out, Theo, and project it onto the front of the AA
Well,
next
David,
week.
yeah.
No, really, I think that's a really nice, well, from my point of view, maybe others would disagree, a very good sort of some kind of concise but not concise, some short poem in a way. Really good, that. Yeah. This is recorded, isn't it?
It is recorded.
Yeah, so you won't do it, so I will do it. I'll project that on the side of the AA.
You can do it, Mr. Green.
Or no, not on the side, in the clouds. I have to do it on water, don't they? In water.
Yes, in water. No, I think that there's a lot of things that need to be expressed for the AA, and there'll be a time and a place for that. But for right now, I think, you know, you guys are doing, I think, interesting work. I would try to keep that spirit alive. I don't want to sound like a slave driver or anything, but I think as soon as you find ideas that are worth working on, you should become quite obsessive about them and try to explore them and make use of the time that you don't have other, let's call it very real world constraints. So you're here as a student and you don't have really other requirements right now in life. So enjoy exploring and experimenting because it gets more difficult. And the summer is 2 months. So from my perspective, take 3 weeks off, you know, find the beach to see that, you know, sit and enjoy the sun, stare at some clouds, be as poetic as you like, as romantic. At the same time, I think, you know, keep thinking about these things, because I think that if you disconnect too much, then it's going to become very forced and mechanical, because deadlines and production and all of that stuff take over at some moment. So I would rather you do it on your own time and use the book and the document as a way to I don't want to say make a manifesto, but have a very clear statement of purpose, which I think is important. Anyway, I think we enjoy having these conversations because there are not so many these days. So I think it's good. You guys should take some time off and stay well. Try to stay away from COVID, please. And please get your vaccinations and all of those things and look after yourselves, okay? And yeah, you should feel happy with the progress that you guys made. And I was proud of you guys. I think you did a good job. But I think you're just starting to scratch the surface, so we have a lot to do. Okay? And it's nice that David is part of this conversation because you're a team that you should be interfacing with more. All right? Okay, guys, I'm mindful that I still have 2 more teams to go, and I'm losing people who are supposed to be working with me to give you evaluations. I will ask Sajay and Pierre Andrea to send you their comments, okay? So you have audio comments and their stuff. All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, guys, thank you too.
Thank you, Sue.
Stay well.
Have a nice summer.
You too. We'll be in touch, don't worry. We won't let you go for too far.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you, Daphne.